Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by. Welcome to the Fair Chance Hiring Best Practices and Lessons webinar. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Should you wish to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. If you need to reach an operator at any time, please press *0. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded Monday, February 2nd, 2015. I would now like to turn the conference over to Michelle Rodriguez, Senior Staff Attorney, National Employment Law Project. Please go ahead.
Hi everyone and welcome. It's such a pleasure to have everyone on, and I hope there are no technical difficulties. Everybody's gotten on just fine. As the operator mentioned, I'm a senior staff attorney with the National Employment Law Project, but I'm not sure all of you all know who NELP is. So just a quick snapshot. NELP, we're a national organization, as the name indicates, and we advocate on behalf of low-wage workers and workers who have been shut out of the labor market. And my particular project that I work on, it focuses on this intersection of employment rights of people with records. And so really what we're seeking to do is to ensure that everyone does have a fair chance to compete for jobs. So that's why I'm really excited today to talk to everyone here. And from my understanding from talking to Michael Teru, that we are focusing on in terms of our audience members in Florida. We've had some conversations. I've also talked to Desmond Meade of Faith in Florida, and also with some advocates in Tampa, if you all are familiar with the group HOPE. And so we have been doing some work in Florida, and we're really excited to see that there is interest and opportunity there. So I just want to take us through really quickly of what our agenda looks like so you know what's coming. We're just going to do the national overview of Fair Chance Hiring. I just want to get you guys all up to speed on the latest that's been going on because there's really a lot of exciting momentum across the country. And then we're going to move into the best practices and models, which I think of this as being some of the heart of today's webinar. And what I'm going to be doing is comparing some of our best practices and models with the Tampa ordinance. And this was something that Mike suggested would be helpful since you all are looking at that ordinance as a guide point in Florida. And then finally, we're going to talk about some of the opposition's arguments, so some of the common arguments that do come up, and we'll do that in a bit of a myth and fact format. So I also just wanted to mention too, after each section, there'll be an opportunity for questions, and so hopefully you all see that chat feature that's at the bottom. And I just got a note from Cynthia saying audio is lost. So everyone should know that audio is through the phone. It's the call-in number that I sent earlier, and I'm just going to paste it to everyone again. You should be calling in to listen at this phone number that I just sent out. So hopefully that's getting to everyone. Even on the call-in number, Cynthia is mentioning that the audio is going in and out. Cynthia, I would just say maybe connect with the operator then if you can, because I am not going to be able to help you with that. So hopefully it's working for other folks, and you guys do have that call-in number right there. Sorry about that, Cynthia. So moving on then, in terms of talking about what fair chance hiring is, you all are probably familiar with this term, ban the bucks, and we've started using this phrase, fair chance hiring. And the reason for that is because we want to signal the most effective policy is not just about taking off that box off of the job application, but as well incorporating other components, like making sure that if a conviction history is going to be considered, you look at whether it's job related. You also see if time has passed, or also give the person the opportunity to show they've been rehabilitated. And then there are some other components that you can add into your policy to really make sure that other components like accuracy and transparency and some of the consumer protection laws that are out there are incorporated. Ban the box is a very important slogan though, and this one was coined by All of Us or None, and I think it is a really strong rallying cry to take that conviction question off of the application. So absolutely, I think that should be a good emphasis, but as well we do want to encourage some other components of a good policy to be in place. So I just want to give you a brief scope here of let you kind of get a view of what the movement looks like right now. And so you can't see the details of this map. All of the little dots represent the cities and counties that have adopted policies, and where you see the darkened colored spots on the states, the solid colors, those are states that have actually adopted policies. And so you can see this is really growing, and there are a couple of them, a few of them in Florida, and let's see more. Let's see more coming there. And what is exciting is we are getting really close to almost 100 cities and counties that have adopted policies. I think we're at about 98 right now, so just a couple more, and we're going to have a nice really point of data to kind of capture that this is huge. All right. I just wanted to also lift up some important voices that have spoken on this issue of Ban the Box and Fair Chance. For instance, if you all didn't know, I think it's pretty significant that last year Governor Christie in New Jersey did sign legislation that applied to private employers. And he made a statement along with signing that bill, this very grandiose statement about today we're ending employment discrimination when he signed the Ban the Box legislation. I wish that was the case. It's certainly an important step, but I think what's important about that is to show that there is this bipartisan support, that this is something that's really getting national attention, such that we see major employers like Target, Walmart, Bed Bath & Beyond, Home Depot is another one actually that have taken the conviction history question off of the job application. And if you didn't catch it, My Brother's Keeper, the initiative from Obama's administration, their task force report that came out in May of last year absolutely focused on Ban the Box as an opportunity to ensure that there's a fair chance for workers who are trying to get into the job market. So that was also really exciting. All right, so that gives you just kind of the scope of things. There we are in terms of where we are in the national movement. This is a good time for any questions. So I direct you all to the chat function. If you see it on the left-hand side of the computer, feel free to just go ahead and type in any questions that come up. And if I do see them while I'm talking, and it's appropriate to do so, I will draw attention to that. But right now we're going to move ahead then and make our way into the best practices and models and think about what we see with Tampa's ordinance as well. Okay. So moving ahead here. We actually have a best practices and models guide. It's a pretty comprehensive guide, and it's on the website www.nelp.org/banthebox. And so I'm taking pieces from that, and I'm going to just get in deeper than what you see in that particular document. But we'll be going through the points that actually do parallel what you will find on that website. So this first point about avoiding stigmatizing language, what do I mean by that? I really give credit to All of Us or None for this particular point. This is something they've really emphasized in their organizing. And again, this is, if you're not familiar with All of Us or None, they're led by formerly incarcerated people. And one of the important things that they've raised is using language like ex-offenders or ex-con or ex-felon, but that's really language that keeps people in the box of being seen as a criminal. And what we want to do instead is lead with people. So say people with records or formerly incarcerated people, and that way we're trying to change the narrative. and just to point out for Tampa's ordinance, it does refer in the whereas section to ex-offenders. I think that was the only point that I saw that particular terminology, so it's just something to keep in mind. I will say this, there are plenty of groups out there that are doing terrific work that embrace the term ex-offenders. It's not that this is a universally held belief, it's just something to consider in our use of language. So I did see a question that came in, why can't we bring this up to the state legislation? And I think that's a good question, and one you all should think about as a coalition. I think a lot of places have approached this in terms of going at the local level, cities and counties, because it is so much more of a doable campaign than doing state legislation. But if you do have the bandwidth for it, it can be the right move. Particularly after you've gotten a few wins locally, that can be a strategy to consider. Okay, taking a look here. Number 2, limit background checks. Now what do I mean by that? There are several cities that have agreed to not background check for every job position for the city. So Boston, Baltimore, Austin, Texas, Minneapolis, those are all examples of some of the cities that instead have said, look, we're not going to do background checks for everybody, because why? Not every job requires a background check. We're only going to do it for what we see as sensitive job positions. And this can be a really effective way to just ensure that the stigma of the record isn't unreasonably influencing an employer's decision. So it's something to keep in mind. I will tell you not all cities and counties are going to go for that, but there are some that are willing to consider it, and it is one way to just cut on costs for the city because they're not doing the background check, and also just take that out of the equation for jobs that aren't sensitive. In terms of Tampa's ordinance, I couldn't tell from looking at the ordinance whether it was the practice of the city to background check for all jobs or not. So it just may be an administrative question. And if you're thinking about your particular policy in your local city and county, it's just one of those things that you want to ask the HR folks or the administration. Is that something that's done right now? Do they background check for all job positions, or is it only for certain ones? Something to keep in mind. Okay, so moving on. This point about avoiding blanket exclusions. What I mean by that is that there are some places that will require some kind of statement, like on the job application most commonly, that says this employer or we will not automatically disqualify anybody based on an arrest or conviction, or an arrest or conviction will not be the sole determinant for an employment decision. Or some places have a more generic equal employer statement. All to say, this can just be helpful to just encourage people with records to apply. And for Tampa's ordinance in particular, it is in the whereas statement. And just a step back for you all in terms of what the structure of an ordinance is, a lot of times they'll have like findings or whereas statements. So that's what I'm referring to when I say whereas. So in the whereas statement for the ordinance, it does say that the city complies with all state and federal laws, and that the city will not disqualify a candidate solely because of a conviction. So that's helpful to have there. And the suggestion here would just be consider whether you want, per the ordinance, to require in the job application itself to have some kind of disclaimer or not. So again, it's just something for you to consider. So moving along, so direct relationship. What am I talking about with that? I'm actually referring specifically to something that's in the EEOC guidance. And as I note here, there's a couple of times that you'll see EEOC, and for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the EEOC guidance is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. That's a U.S. federal agency that's in charge of enforcing anti-discrimination law, so civil rights law, which they're an agency that actually has done a lot on arrest and conviction records, including putting forth a 2012 guidance on the use of arrest and conviction records for all employers, not just government employers, private employers as well. And one of the things that's recommended in the guidance to help ensure that there are fair opportunities for people with records is to say, hey employers, when you're considering a conviction record, you should only be considering a conviction record that's directly related, so that it's job related, and comparing the nature of the person's conviction and the job itself, its duties. For instance, that's where you look at that nexus between the two. So I would say this is pretty common, and it does track the EEOC guidance. It's one of those things that you would want to include in your ordinance if you could. And when I look at Tampa's ordinance, there wasn't one that set out that this was a limitation, that only job-related conviction should be considered, or that only a job-related conviction would be disqualifying. It does say in its limiting provisions, so a little bit different, not on the positive side, but limiting provision, that nothing in the article would prohibit the city from denying a job based on a conviction directly related, but that's a little bit different from saying you can't disqualify someone unless it's a directly related job. So something to consider. You know, I did see another question coming in here, and I'm just going to take a look at this. Okay, so I will follow up with you, Deborah. I did see your question. And for other folks that do have questions along with the presentation, you know, don't hesitate to send them in. If it's something that is more of, I think, a one-on-one question, then I will make sure to follow up with you on that afterwards. So looking at number 5, removing inquiries from job applications. You know, this is something absolutely that's in the Tampa ordinance, and I think that it's spelled out nicely. It's very clear that the City of Tampa will not inquire about an applicant's criminal history on the job application. What is less clear on that particular point is whether an oral inquiry is allowed. Now one would say, you know, the spirit of the ordinance, you would think that oral or written, you shouldn't be asking about the conviction history, but it's actually helpful to probably spell that out. So I would say to do a better job with that particular provision, it would be better if it was clear that either oral or written actually should not have any inquiries into conviction history. Tampa does wait until the applicant is a finalist before there is any conviction history inquiry, and that's a pretty strong threshold, so that's important. All right, let's move along. So this point on no self-reporting. So what does that mean? And this is not specifically in the ordinance, nor is it often in ordinances. It's mainly in administrative policies. What I mean by that is sometimes what will happen is that a city or county, when they do finally get the conviction history information, whatever point it is, whether it's a finalist, conditional offer, or before that, some places do have thresholds that come sooner, such as, you know, being otherwise qualified. Not as strong as the determination of somebody being a finalist, but in those instances, what the city or county sometimes does is have a questionnaire, and instead of running a background check, they will have individuals self-report. Now, the tricky thing about that is, unfortunately, some places are using that as kind of a lie test, that if you put incorrect information on the self-disclosure report, then it's somehow an indication that you're being untruthful, which unfortunately is really just not the case. It may give the appearance of being untruthful, but mostly what we find is that individuals just don't have the clearest understanding of all of the different pieces of their criminal record, and really, if you've looked at a criminal background check report, it's quite confusing, even if it's your own, because it's a confusing process. There's the arrest, there's the charge, what did you actually end up with? A conviction can be very different. And so all of those different pieces then end up being really challenging for an individual to report accurately at times. So we definitely advocate against any self-reporting questions. Now, it gets trickier if it's a place that doesn't do a background check and all they do is some kind of a self-reporting mechanism. I'd just say for that that you would want to make sure that the city, the county, the employer wasn't putting so much weight on that self-reporting that it's being seen as a truth detector test, because that is certainly, I think, a mark of unfairness, and we've seen that be a problem. Okay, moving along. If a person is rejected, shouldn't they be informed? That's a basic consumer protection piece that we've seen in the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And I mention that because you may be familiar with it in terms of credit reports. So when your credit report comes to you, you have the opportunity to check on inaccuracies. Same thing with the criminal background check. You should have the opportunity to see if there are any problems there. So if you're going to be rejected about it, you should know that you're rejected because of that record and have the opportunity then to correct anything. Because I'll tell you, there's a lot of problems out there with those criminal background checks, a lot of inaccuracies, and so it's just one of those basic fairness pieces that you want to make sure that somebody has that opportunity. And I thought Tampa's ordinance was pretty good about this. It does say that when a finalist is deemed to be ineligible for a position, that person, they're going to be notified and they're going to have an opportunity to respond and give even additional information, and they have 5 business days to do that. When we advocate for as strong as we can in terms of time frames, we try to argue for something closer to 7 or 10 days, but 5 days is pretty good. 5 days is pretty solid, so that's not a bad time frame to rest on. It is something, of course, you should take back to your membership of, does this make sense? Does this work with the population? But from what I've seen across the country, it's pretty good. So then thinking about right and time to respond, I just basically mentioned the time frame on that, and I just wanted to highlight, since I did mention that Durham County in North Carolina, they do allow the applicant 7 calendar days from the date of mailing, and in Hartford, Connecticut, it's also 7 business days. But again, I do think it's pretty good in Tampa as well. So moving along, when you are thinking about your particular policy, it's a really important question. What's the scope? Is it just going to be a policy that applies to city and counties? Is it going to apply to the vendors and contractors as well? Or is it going to be the most comprehensive and apply to private employers? So my understanding is that you all are thinking about this and working this out. I will flag for you that the folks we've been in contact with in Tampa who have put this ordinance in place, they're looking at vendors and contractors right now. So trying to say that government contractors, those contractors and vendors that are benefiting from the city by having a contract, they're going to be required to meet their ordinance. So that's something they're working on, and I would definitely consider that if that's possible for you all. It's a step down from private employers, but it can definitely be more manageable. And last year, both Indianapolis and Louisville, which required a lot of bipartisan buy-in, were able to pass those ordinances that applied to contractors and vendors, and almost unanimously. So I think that that's pretty great. So something to keep in mind for you. And if you are thinking about private employers, I'd just highlight for you that there really is this trend towards private employers. We're now at 6 states that have statewide legislation that applies to private employers. So that's pretty fantastic. And there are many more cities and counties that are widening their net in their ordinances to include private employers. certainly a heavy lift. I'm not going to lie to you on that. It's a heavy lift, but if you have the backing for it, it is something to consider. And if not right now, perhaps the first step is thinking of something more like the city or county or vendors and contractors, and then seeing what you can do in the future. Now, I also highlight for you enforcement, which under that category I would also include some thoughts around data collection and reporting, because really, whatever your ordinance, your policy is, it's only as good as it's going to be enforced. And so it's really important to pay attention to this. Doing the work ahead of time to find out, what's the mechanism going to be for enforcement? Is there any ability to file complaints? Is there going to be any regular data collection, such as the agency reporting on any grievances or complaints that are filed from workers? All of those are different ideas of how you can increase enforcement. And if you are doing something with contractors and vendors, there's some special enforcement tools that can be there, like making sure that the contract can be revoked if the contractor isn't meeting the requirements. And so that can be pretty strong. So something to definitely keep in mind. I'm just going to pause here. Talked a lot about different policies here, best practices and models, and I'm just going to see for a moment to see if anybody has any questions. We are going to be moving next to some of the arguments around opposition, so we'll be getting to that. But if folks have any questions at all, feel free to go ahead and type those in. All right. So moving ahead then. So you all have heard this particular myth, I'm sure. This kind of idea that just sticks with people out there, that they're not questioning that if you have a record, you're being seen as a criminal, instead of really understanding that we have a diverse population of people that are walking around with records. We have an estimated 70 million U.S. adults that have some type of arrest or conviction record, and that translates to nearly 1 in 3 U.S. adults. So the point here is, look, anyone can have a record, and tons of people have really minor records and really old records as well, decades old potentially. And the unfortunate thing is, as many of you know, even with really old records, that can still be coming up and haunting you and preventing you from getting a job. And I did get a question here on, about whether we could recommend a piece of model legislation that we would find particularly strong and well crafted. Absolutely. So we have models that we've developed, and I have that list of model practices, best practices and models that's on our website at NELP.org/banthebox, and you can download that document that has those models in there. And what I can do as well, depending on what kind of legislation you're interested in, whether it's contractors, private employers, or just city and county, you just let me know what you're interested in, and I can share with your group some of the models that we see for some of the ones that have actually passed. There are definitely components of the Tampa ordinance that I mentioned today that I thought were quite good. There's just a few areas that I would recommend being a little bit stronger. So just continuing with this point, I think this is a one to keep in mind. We have some really famous examples of people who have records. I mean, we know Martha Stewart does. George W. Bush, Bill Gates, Sir Richard Branson, very successful people, by all accounts, who have records. And so part of it is just breaking down those stereotypes of what it means to have a record, and really understanding that people move on in their lives from some one moment in time where they ended up with a record. And so that's part of the work that all of us need to do in our advocacy, and making sure that people really understand the breadth of the issue, and that absolutely people do move on from their past. So another myth that I run into all the time. I think that there is this misunderstanding that if you have any type of criminal record, that means, for some reason you're not a highly skilled person or you don't have job skills. Now, I absolutely acknowledge there is a population pool, who haven't had job opportunities, who've been kept out of the labor market, and who absolutely may need some job training and soft skills and all of those pieces. And that's a population that is a subset of the 70 million adults with records. But there are millions and millions of adults with records that are highly skilled, have been working for a long time. And so that's important to keep in mind. As well, even for people that may not have the job skills immediately, there are employers like Johns Hopkins Hospital who have focused on, with a program, ensuring that they're hiring people with records that have absolutely reported that their folks are strong employees. They have a high loyalty rate with the hospital, and they have performed very well on the job. So it's all to say, again, it's breaking down those stereotypes. And when the opposition says things like this, that this isn't, we only hire cream of the crop, or we don't want to hire criminals. These are all things to keep in mind to make sure that there's a more nuanced conversation that's happening. So another issue I think that absolutely comes up in the community: why should we care about people with records and their job opportunities? Why should I, as a business person or as an employer, give a person with a record, any kind of a shot? That's kind of a thinking that's out there, with so many people that are in challenging circumstances. Why this particular population? And I would just say again, it goes back to the point of that we have 70 million U.S. adults with some type of record. We have to pay attention to all of our population and community, and certainly we cannot be dismissive of nearly 1 in 3 adults in the United States. That is just undercutting our economy, undercutting ourselves. And there was a great report that was released by CEPR that showed that the reduced output of people that had felonies and prison records, that reduced output was an estimated 57 and 65 billion in losses to the U.S. economy in 1 year. And that was in 2008. So for those that don't understand the human capital argument, that don't understand the moral argument, the money argument is also helpful, that this is important to our economy and that it makes sense for all of our folks in our community to be making the tax contributions and saving money by keeping people out of the system. I got a question that came in about why is Florida one of the least forgiving states. And I think in terms, particularly, I think the references to some of the harsh laws that may be in the state. And I would definitely defer to you all in the community of your thoughts on that, why you think that there may be some particular harsh attitudes towards people with records and not believing in second chances. And so that's something really important to think about for your campaign and try to hit on those points. I think some of the arguments that have been really successful are the ones that I've mentioned. Emphasizing that this is a large population, emphasizing that absolutely employers have found hiring people with records, it can be good for their business, that we can't afford it economically, and that we want our population to work. Those are all very important arguments to keep in mind. And the idea of redemption and second chance. I think thinking about you all's particular work and being a moral authority on the kind of the faith-based coalition speaks beautifully on that, and I think it peels all across the political spectrum as well. So it's a strong point. It's definitely one that you all have and so should absolutely use. So this is one that comes up too, and This is something that employers may mention. This is something that people in the community may mention. They don't feel safe, with someone that has a criminal record. And again, I think that that really goes back to those stereotypes about what it means to have a record. It's a lack of understanding that most people walking around with records, we're talking about some really minor offenses. We're talking about people with arrests. There's such a wide range. And again, even for people that have more serious offenses, we just need to do a better job of getting those stories out about people changing, people making mistakes and moving on from them and being different people than they are now. So in terms of your campaign work and working with the media and getting those worker stories out there of people who have changed their lives, I think that that's really appealing and something to keep in mind. I would also point out as well that there are good studies out there that show if you care about reducing the risk of reoffending in your community, then let's make sure people are employed. There's a group out in Los Angeles called Homeboy Industries, if some of you are familiar with that. And one of their slogans is, "Nothing stops a bullet like a job." And that's really resonated with some folks. The idea being, well, if we want to stop problems on the street, with violence, part of it is really addressing people's lack of hope, lack of opportunity. And if people were able to support themselves, contribute to their community, that's where most people want to be and what most people want to do. So a job is really the pathway to that. I think some of the evidence that's out there in terms of research can be really helpful for that. Yes, and this point that came in as well, that there wouldn't be reoffending if people had a job to work. Absolutely. Yes, I think it does resonate with folks too. So thank you for pointing that out, one of the participants. So I think that this is not widely understood, so I'm highlighting it for you all. This idea that a lot of employers believe they can just have no hire policies for people with records, and you've probably seen it. I did a report a few years ago where we took a report and looked at Craigslist, and we saw that there were a lot of job ads out there that said something like, "No felons apply. If you have a record, don't even bother." Just really awful language and outright bans on hiring people with records. And it's actually illegal. I had mentioned the EEOC guidance before, and it's very clear you shouldn't have these blanket bans. Really what they are recommending, and this is for all employers, and I'm not just talking about government employers, you shouldn't have a no hire policy. And if you do, you're likely violating federal civil rights law. Title VII is the employment anti-discrimination law that the EEOC is in charge of enforcing. And so what they advise instead is employers should make case-by-case assessments. So doing the individualized assessment, which I think just makes sense. It's in terms of thinking about hiring people, that's what you want to keep in mind. Okay, so some of the other pieces that may come up, from the opposition is, oh, does this policy really work? Unfortunately, what we can say at this point is absolutely. We've had places that have had this policy in place for years now. We have almost 100 cities and counties, 13 states that have adopted legislation. Talk about a good track record, and I haven't heard of any problems, anywhere actually across the country. That's pretty amazing. And you will get people reporting back like Mark Washington, who is the Human Resources Director out of Austin, saying, hey, this is really working. This is a policy we really believe in, and we've absolutely had qualified people end up working for the city because of that. So I think that's a good example. As well, and this is all highlighted in our research fact sheet that's at NELP.org/bantheBox. There are a couple of studies that have come out. Study is probably too strong of a word, but there's data that's come out of a couple of locations, Durham County being one of them, Atlanta, Minneapolis, they all showed that there was an increase in hiring people with records after the policy was put in place, which I think is really fantastic, and it helps answer that question. Look, is this policy something that can be effective? And we can say absolutely, yes, this is an effective policy, and we haven't heard of any problems with any of these policies. There are no policies that have been repealed that I know of. The first legislation that I know of is from 1998, and that was for Hawaii, for the whole state applying to private employers. And so we have a long track record of these policies and laws being in place. So we covered everything that we wanted to in our agenda, and we're now in the space of just any questions from folks. And I would say use your chat feature to go ahead and send in any questions, and I can try to address them. I also, again, want to point out, as any questions are coming in, that we do have a very comprehensive toolkit. It's at this site. It's nelp.org/banthebox, which I have mentioned multiple times on the call today. There is a one-pager, like a fact sheet that you can use with frequently asked questions. You can download that in a Word format and then just tailor it to your local audience. The best practices and model policies piece that I noticed that I noted earlier, like that has all of the best practices that I talked about and examples of model policies too. And there is something for the cities and counties. You can download a Word version of it and change it up for your local area as well. The research summary, it's several pages long, and it includes, and what we tried to do is compile all of the research that we know of that supports these policies that you can use in your advocacy, and give you the top lines for those, so some bullet points on those points. And then we have citations, so you can find those actual resources yourself and use that. And when I mentioned the effectiveness studies in Durham County, there's a link to that particular report as well, so I do recommend that. And then finally we have our comprehensive guide. It's of all the policies and laws. I do my best to try to keep it up to date. Right now it has detailed in it the 13 states, nearly 100 cities and counties, and it has links to all of the policies and practices that we know of. And you can always email me at mrodriguez@nelp.org if you have any questions. I did get a question about anything regarding state legislation. We also have on that same website, so the best practices and model policies, that particular resource has included in it model policies for state legislation. I would absolutely take a look at that. And as well, in our guide of policies and laws, it's a state and cities and counties guide. So there are links to all of the states that have passed legislation. And I also tried to include in there, of the state legislation that I know that's currently pending, that's also in there. So you can see what kind of bills are being passed around. I actually do believe that there may be a Florida bill that is either was just in session last session, or there may be one that was introduced. But as far as I know, it didn't really have a lot of legs to it, and it didn't go very far. But I would definitely defer to you all on the ground in terms of what you know about that. The last time I checked on it, I didn't know of advocates that were really behind it. It seemed to be more of legislatively driven by one of the legislators. So it's something to take a look at. Again, in terms of strategy, it may be that you build some of the local jurisdictions first and then go to the state level. Although, just as a counterexample, I'll mention Nebraska. Of course, it's a very different state, but There were no cities and counties that had passed any legislation, and they were able to pass a state bill last year. So it's something to consider, and it just depends on what strategy that you all think is best and what you all have the bandwidth for. So if there are any questions, I would say this is a last call for them. Go ahead and type any of those in. And as Deborah mentioned, yes, I would absolutely think that if with the legislator who has introduced the legislation, I know he did last year, I believe it was, I'm blanking on the individual's name, but it actually is in our guide. And you should absolutely go ahead and reach out to him. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions at this point. I hope this was helpful. Please do give me feedback. I will absolutely touch base with Mike and we'll see where we can follow up. But other than that, I want to thank you all for your time, and hopefully we'll talk soon, and please let me know how I can be supportive. We really want to see some more activity in Florida. So thank you. Take care.